I'm Matthew Smith. Tuesday morning, BBC Wiltshire, and the case of a Wiltshire man who wants a doctor to be able to end his life without being prosecuted is starting in the High Court today. 58-year-old Tony Nicklinson from Melksham. He suffers from locked-in syndrome, which means his body is paralysed, but his mind is unaffected. He says his life is intolerable, and he wants to be able to end it when he likes. Well, in a moment, I'll be asking a leading expert what's known about the causes of this syndrome and if there's any treatment. First, though, Mr. Nicklinson's been speaking to our medical correspondent, Fergus Walsh.
Tony, if you were able to speak in court, what would your message to the judge be?
I would remind the judge that this shouldn't be about an arcane interpretation of the law, but it should be about the quality of life for a human equals me. If he decides in my favour, I can have a pain-free death. If his decision goes against me, all I can look forward to is a life I don't want that will become increasingly more miserable as I get older, or the prospect of starving myself to death.
Can you sum up for me why you want a doctor to be allowed to take your life?
It is wrong that I should be discriminated against just because I am disabled, such that I cannot take my own life. The ability to decide when, where and how one's life will end is the basic human right. To deny somebody that right for whatever reason cannot be justified, but to deny somebody that right by discrimination in this age of equality is beyond the pale. Anybody who says this is okay should be ashamed of themselves for the suffering they are responsible for. I have chosen a doctor because he knows what he is doing and somebody else may not.
How difficult is your life at present? What has to be done for you?
Life is very difficult at the moment, and it gets slightly more difficult each day. Absolutely everything has to be done for me. Feeding me, scratching an itch, cleaning my nose, moving me, cleaning my teeth, washing, you name it, and I cannot do it. I could go on, but I'm sure you get the idea. It has reminded me that we all take our independence for granted, and you don't appreciate what you have until you no longer have it.
When might you want a doctor to end your life?
I don't know exactly when I will go. I don't have a particular date in mind. I suspect it may be sooner rather than later, because each day is getting a little bit more uncomfortable and harder to bear.
And what do you say to those who argue that this would be murder?
To those who say what I want is murder, I would say that it can only be murder if the person who is killed didn't want to die. I know that consent isn't a defense against a charge of murder, but that doesn't mean that consent is irrelevant. Beating gives some people pleasure and ask for it to be done to them. They have given their consent. Somebody else may consider the very idea as an assault and refuse to give their consent, but are beaten nevertheless. Because in the first case consent was given, the beating is not considered an assault, but it is in the second case because consent was withheld. I know murder is more serious than being beaten with a cane, but the principle holds even though the degree of seriousness is different. I can see no reason why the law cannot be changed so that it recognises the killing of one by another is not always wrong.
Tony Nicklinson from Melksham, using his special computer that he uses to communicate, speaking there to the BBC's medical correspondent Fergus Walsh, and it's Mr. Nicklinson's case that's beginning today at the High Court. But away from the legal arguments, what exactly is locked-in syndrome, and can it be treated? Dr. Srivas Chennu is from the Department of Clinical Neurosciences at Cambridge University, joining me on BBC Wiltshire this morning. Dr. Chennu, morning to you.
Hi there, good morning.
Is it possible to say what causes locked-in syndrome?
Yes, we do know quite a bit about what causes the locked-in syndrome, and the most common cause is a very focal or very specific lesion or damage to what is known as the brainstem, a part of the brain deep inside. That's basically the gateway to your spinal cord, and hence controls a lot of your bodily movements and muscles.
In the case of Mr. Nicklinson, it was a stroke that he had. Is that normally the case for other people who suffer from it?
That's one of the most common causes. A stroke is basically hemorrhage that is occurring in that specific part of the brain, and it's a very unfortunate part of the brain to be affected because it leaves your higher brain function, your decision-making, your ability to understand the world outside is completely unaffected. But the ability to respond to it is completely taken away.
So is that always the case then? The locked in actually refers to your inability to use your body and not an inability to use your mind?
Exactly. So as in Tony's case, he's perfectly able to use his mind and make complex arguments, and sort of rational decision-making is completely intact, but he's not able to move his body to his wish.
Is there ever any debate, though, because I know this has come up before when talking about Tony Nicklinson, that you say he's got locked-in syndrome, but to some people they don't see a person as being locked in when they do have that ability to communicate.
True, but this is a matter of opinion, perhaps, or scientific debate, really. But the point is that in the end, some people in the locked-in state might be able to lead a reasonable life with sort of enough amount of happiness, as it were, in their own perception in that state, but others might not, and that's an individual question, and that perhaps is more an ethical or an emotional one than a scientific one.
Well, I've read one description which says locked-in syndrome, it feels a bit like being buried alive. Would you agree with that?
Well, that's quite an emotive way of putting it, but I can see how it's also referred to as a pseudo-coma. It's as if your body is completely shut down, but inside there is a person sort of locked away in a figurative coffin, if you see what I mean.
Yeah.
It's quite a dramatic way of putting it, because not all locked-in patients suffer complete paralysis. Most of them have some amount, very limited amount of preserved bodily functions, but that's about it.
Well, obviously, Mr. Nicklinson is very seriously disabled. And you mentioned, though, there are different degrees of this syndrome.
Yes.
If you have, say, a bit more movement, is there any effective treatment for it?
I'm afraid not, and this is perhaps the big challenge to the medical establishment and to sort of clinical research, which is that currently what's available are sort of limited techniques that mitigate some of the symptoms, perhaps try to restore some movement to some of the muscles, but there's no treatment in the sense of a drug that could cure a person in a locked-in state.
So what, you'd be using you'd be trying to stimulate their muscles, using electrical impulses, something like that?
There are specific techniques where you can sort of stimulate some muscles, so as to stimulate the pathway to the brain in the other direction, as it were, so as to try and get some activity going, but it's not going to restore them to the state they were in before. And that's perhaps the biggest thing that patients and their families have to come to terms with, which is obviously very challenging.
But there are a couple of cases, though, aren't there, where someone who's been diagnosed with locked-in syndrome has made more or less a complete recovery?
Yes, there are these sort of very rare cases, exactly. And in those few cases, remarkably, we don't know exactly why, those patients have made a recovery. So, yes, you're right. But usually, perhaps that would be something that happens relatively early after the sort of original point of injury.
Yeah, so Tony Nicklinson had his stroke 7 years ago. Is there any chance he could recover?
Well, that's something I can't really comment on, because I've never obviously interacted with Tony. And, it's really hard to say for me directly. Yes.
Okay. Well, thank you for your opinion and your expertise this morning. Dr. Srivas Chennu from the Department of Clinical Neurosciences there at Cambridge University.